Thank you so much. Your pronunciation was great. Clare MacGillivray, yeah. So thank you so much for having me today. It's a real honour, especially today is International Refugee Day, the day when we show solidarity with refugees globally. I've loved hearing about your work today and how so much of it is rooted in transformational change with communities. As I was introduced, I'm Clare MacGillivray, the Director of Making Rights Real, which is a grassroots charity that I set up during COVID to support communities in Scotland to name and claim their rights. So we work alongside marginalised communities to collectively organise around human rights issues, to hold duty bearers to account and to campaign on human rights issues. And we also are active in raising consciousness about human rights with communities. There's a few logos up on the screen, and that's because I was an Atlantic Fellow this year and was really delighted to be part of the programme. And this research about what human rights defenders need to flourish came from a bit of the project that I was involved in. I've been invited to speak about what the human rights defenders need to flourish, but I do want to throw it back to you, first of all. So hands up if you would call yourself a human rights defender. In everyday chat with your pals and your neighbours, are you a human rights defender? Great, that's fantastic. What we'll cover today is about the term human rights defender. What are the challenges of being a human rights defender? What are the hopes and joys? What already works? And what else might be helpful for us in terms of supporting human rights defenders to flourish? And I'll finish off with some wicked questions. But now, I want you to chat to the person next to you. This is a bit of a graveyard shift where you're all really tired. So talk to the next person beside you for 30 seconds each about what is a human rights defender. What words do you think about when you hear the words human rights defender? Go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, shh. So, what did you notice when you were talking to each other? I saw loads of flashing eyes, hands waving, animated chat about being a human rights defender. So, I think often as community workers, if we're working for social change, we are human rights defenders, even if we don't always use that term to describe ourselves. And one of the words that keeps coming up for me when I talk about human rights defenders is this: fearless. People who are fearless in the defence of rights. And let's face it, we need to be fearless. Why we're doing work with communities around human rights. This is really important, this quote. I love it from Eleanor Roosevelt, who was chair of the drafting committee for the UN Declaration of Human Rights. 75 years ago this year, in case you didn't know, you could plan a party for Human Rights Day. But what she said is, where do human rights begin? In small places close to home. And if human rights don't have any meaning there, then they have little meaning anywhere. And I always try to keep that quote in my heart in the work that I'm doing with communities. What I also notice quite a lot with communities that I'm working with is that change doesn't happen quickly enough for the people that need the change most. And we need to be fearless human rights defenders because there are so many challenges for people accessing their human rights in the small places close to home. What's the context of what we're doing in human rights? Here are some of the assumptions that I'm making when I'm exploring it. We're facing incredible challenges globally. I've heard today about Indigenous communities who have faced generations of intergenerational trauma perpetuated because of colonialism. I've seen global inequalities in healthcare and in poverty. I see environmental catastrophe and a neoliberal economy that upholds the power structures and continues to marginalise communities to embed the structural inequalities that the most marginalised are facing. We see the rise of right-wing populism and racism and increased areas of war, conflict and violence. But these issues are not experienced equally. I'm from Dundee, and this is Mary Brooksbank, who's my heroine. She was a socialist, a trade union activist, a songwriter, and a weaver from Dundee. And she sang a song which had one of the verses saying, "Oh dear me, the world is ill divided. Them that work the hardest are aye the least provided." And for me, that's the context in which I work. In spite of all that grimness that we have in the world around us, we have a lot of hope. I've heard incredible stories of hope today. Particularly, I've been at some of the Indigenous communities, workshops, and it's been really inspiring for me, the hope that's come from their way of looking at the world. But I think we need to make assumptions that inequality is not inevitable. We collectively can really transform structural inequality. What's exciting is that people are building social movements all over the world, and they're coming together to be able to influence issues which impact on human rights. And for me, I've been convinced for the last 10 years of my career that we can use a rights-based community development approach to change systems. And if we believe that through collective action we can use human rights to change systems, we really need to ask, what do human rights defenders need to flourish? What conditions do we need in our societies and in our community work for human rights defenders to flourish? So, what is a human rights defender? Hands up if this was the definition that you gave in your wee chat between the two of you. No, maybe one or two. Okay. So the UN Declaration of Human Rights Defenders is 25 years old this year, and human rights defenders are defined as people who individually or with others act to promote or protect human rights in a peaceful manner. This could be in a voluntary role or in a paid role. And the Declaration recognises the important role human rights defenders have in collectivising action to advance human rights. But it also was a moment where there was a paradigm shift, and it addressed not just states as human rights defenders, but everyone. It emphasises there's a global human rights movement, and all of us have a role to fulfil in making rights real for everyone. We also have a special rapporteur for human rights defenders, Mary Lawler from Ireland, whose role it is to support the work of defenders across the world. Why are they agents of change? Why is it important to support human rights defenders? Amnesty has said that supporting human rights defenders is one of the most effective ways to create just, equal and open societies with human rights and justice for all. And we find human rights defenders in every field, in every discipline and in every country. And they're often uncredited for their success, for their tireless work and their dangerous work to advance human rights for all of us. So as community development workers, activists or community members, we might not actively describe ourselves as human rights defenders in our daily life. But if we're working with rights holders or as a rights holder ourselves to hold duty bearers to account, to tackle injustice and human rights issues, then we definitely are. And being a human rights defender is a powerful statement. I'm a big believer in rights-based community work. Community development for me is a rights-based profession and practice because human rights are at the heart of our values, our professional standards. As a profession, it should be embedded in our practice. We've got international human rights treaties, and the principles of a rights-based approach could be embedded in all that we do to support communities to challenge power structures which are repressive. The panel principles of a rights-based approach put participation right at the top and rights holders right at the centre of any work. And community workers and communities are at the heart of challenging structures, holding the state to account, shaking that tree of power to challenge institutional racism, misogyny, colonialism, to advance human rights issues. And we know that power has been built up in the hands of a few over many centuries. And this neoliberal system, which concentrates and exacerbates wealth and power in the hands of the few, continues to marginalise the communities that we serve. So we can't talk about challenging systems without talking about power. And the risks of speaking truth to power brings enormous danger for human rights defenders. Plus, we don't celebrate the successes enough, and there are many. We can't stop now, though, because the rights that we've won, although they're not enjoyed equally by everyone, are being rolled back globally. We're seeing that, and we see that in the United Kingdom, for example, where the UK government is pulling back on human rights. And so we need to continue to fight. So, what about the term human rights defenders? Do we use it? Do community workers describe themselves as human rights defenders? Do they? Do you? Does your neighbours? Do your friends? Incredible people are doing extraordinary things. And I've often found the human rights defenders that I meet have tremendous humility, compassion, energy, and drive to keep going, even when they don't think they're going to win. So does the term really matter? For me, in international frameworks, it does. And we've got a system that protects human rights defenders and monitors attacks on human rights defenders. So if we have these, we need to be using it a bit more as community workers. I know that in Scotland, there's a really strong unfeirty movement. If you've not heard that word before, Google it. And join the movement of children's human rights defenders and people who want to stand up for children's human rights. They don't seem to have that much of a problem in grasping the term human rights defenders. In fact, they love it. And at a recent cabinet meeting with the Scottish Cabinet, went into a meeting and said, "Hello, Minister, I'm a human rights defender," and it was just absolutely priceless. But if people at the grassroots don't use the term, should we force it? Should we describe ourselves as warriors for human rights, as one of the activists in Scotland that I know called herself? So over to you for discussion about that over tea. But for me, it helps to shift the narrative as we, as workers, in communities. It says really strongly that we're upholding human rights. What are the challenges? Well, you know them already if you're a human rights defender. The challenges that we face as human rights defenders and community workers give us big ethical dilemmas. On one hand, it's our role to support communities, to effectively critique human rights breaches, to speak truth to power in order to support collective action and campaigning on human rights issues. But we also know that human rights defenders are more likely to face danger because of who they are and the human rights that they are trying to protect. LGBTI activists, Indigenous people, minorities, women, lands rights and environmental activists are most at risk of reprisal. And it's often the state, which is supposed to guarantee human rights, which perpetuates this violence. And we know that human rights defenders can bring real dangers in spite of there being laws to protect them. There's often an implementation gap between what a country says it will do and what happens on the ground. It really shocked me to read from Frontline Defenders that there were 401 people murdered as human rights defenders in 26 countries last year. People face death, imprisonment, harassment, physical abuse, trolling, and they face mental and physical breakdown. So it's a terrible time for a lot of people. But what are the hopes and joys? There's also hopes and joys being a human rights defender. We have to celebrate the wins when we get them, whether they're small in our own wee communities or if they've got massive international impact. We've all got a role to play in advancing human rights. And success as a defender can take dogged determination over many years. I swear I never had grey hairs when I started working in human rights. So keeping that positivity that we can win is really helpful. There's tremendous solidarity in being a human rights defender and feeling that others are in solidarity with you on the issues you're campaigning with. And we know that there are some human rights laws changing around the world. In Scotland, for example, we've just launched the consultation about bringing new human rights laws to Scotland. And there are growing movements of people naming and claiming their rights. So I always just look at the incredible activists. If I ever have to have hope, there are mighty activists out there. What works? Finding your tribe and being with the people who have got your back and building all kinds of alliances and solidarity helps. Learning from each other, connecting, helps. Safe spaces, including spaces to get things wrong and make mistakes. And a lot of people commented on the need for support with their mental health and for us as community workers to take a trauma-informed practice when we're working on human rights issues. Participation of human rights defenders in creating the systems that make us safe is also really important, along with accessibility and funding to be able to support our networks of human rights defenders. What do we need to flourish as human rights defenders? Laws and structures to protect us. Legal frameworks of protection that are fully implemented by states for individuals and for us to act collectively. And a domestic law that enables the free movement of human rights defenders in the civic space. We need a good culture, we need good systems, and we need people to be able to speak truth to power. We need learning programs, support for well-being, and independent funding for the work that we do. I've got some wicked questions for you, but I don't mean wicked by intent. I mean wicked because they're like a big ball of wool and they need a bit of untangling, although they might be wicked by intent as well. I'll leave that to you. So, what are you doing in your practice to advance human rights? What systems to protect human rights defenders do you have in the spaces where you work or live, or in your community, in your small places close to home? Are you even talking about human rights defenders in your work? What do you want to see change around the protections for human rights defenders? And here's the last thing for you to do. Get out your phones. Like I'm asking you to get out your phones. Or bits of paper if you're up to that. And I want you to send yourself a text or an email or put in a note. What actions can you take in the next year to advance human rights in your work and to protect human rights defenders? Okay, hang on, like nobody's got the Wi-Fi, what's going on? Put that down as a note for you. Okay, this is your personal commitment. What are you going to do about this? It might be that you're going back to your own community or your family, but what are you going to do? And in a year's time, you can all tweet about this and say, here's what I've done in the past year, this small action that I've taken. So rather than a toast to human rights defenders, it's more a remembrance for those lives lost. And it's also an embattled cry for us as community workers to continue the work that we're doing, being human rights defenders in our work, in our communities, in our countries, in our small places close to home, and in the places where we want to make an impact. I've been Clare MacGillivray. Those are the Twitter handles that you can spam me on. I'm more than happy to be contacted at any time. And thank you once again for this opportunity to be here with you today. I've got a sneaky thing to do. So Michelle partly comes from Dundee, where I came from, and the city of Dundee, because I chaired the last conference in Dundee, wanted to pass on a memento to you, from the people of Dundee to you hosting this conference. We're so proud of you. So thank you.